Hello and welcome back to Chatbot on Robot Republic with me, Josh or Riku. Today I'm joined by another very special guest because I am here with Ron from Silver Rat Studios to discuss your amazing third-person stealth action game, Grey Block. Hello, Ron.
Hey there. It's nice to meet you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's such a pleasure having you on the show, and thank you for coming on because we're going to talk about your amazing game, Grey Blocks, which is available on Steam right now. So if you're watching this interview and you're like, "Oh, go and check it out," well, obviously watch the interview first, and then go and check this game out because it is available on Steam right now, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
That is amazing. So obviously, can you tell our wonderful viewership, kind of a little bit about Grey Blocks? Kind of like, obviously I've done my best, but let's be serious now. I'm a hack journalist, so
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Gray Block is a third-person cinematic stealth action puzzle game that's got some stealth elements, but it's mostly in the topic of in the investigative realm, and it is it's got a strong narrative as well. So it's not necessarily your pure stealth shooter like a Metal Gear Solid. It's definitely got a little bit more of a slower pace and leans on the investigative elements and the story as well. So if those are your things, then I think it'll be a great thing for you to enjoy.
Oh, absolutely. And having played a decent chunk of this game, um, it is really fun. My first question is, where did the inspiration for this come from? But we'll get on to all like the narrative. The narrative is brilliant and the world building is amazing. We'll get to that. I want to know where the inspiration for this game came from because it is such an interesting world and an interesting kind of like idea that you've come up with.
Sure. Inspiration kind of comes to me in a few different ways. I think the top way is that I tend to just like listen to music with headphones on and go out in public. And I don't know what it is about that, but it tends to just put me in a world where I can kind of visualize things. I don't know. It just turns on the creative faucet. This one, I know what song I was listening to. It was by a band called Scary Kids Scaring Kids. And I just had this idea for an ending to a game with this gentleman who is in a psychiatric hospital, and that's where it started. I'd sort of been down the game development path. I was working on a project that was much larger scope prior, and I knew I needed something smaller. And then that's kind of how this happened. It was sort of starting from there, and then taking some elements of video games that I really liked from like Deus Ex, from The Last of Us, from Mass Effect, and even Metal Gear Solid, and just taking those elements and kind of putting it together into a cohesive story. I think that I just wanted to tell, and it just kind of built it out from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really comes across. It's actually quite interesting. When I was playing the game initially, the vibe was very Deus Ex, Metal Gear Solid-esque. This kind of the world you built is absolutely fascinating. Were there any, obviously, we've touched on Metal Gear Solid and Deus Ex and these other kind of like stealth action kind of games being inspiration. Were
Mhm.
there any other types of games, especially, and I'm thinking more about like some of the puzzles, because some of the puzzles in there, it took me a while. Regular
Mhm.
viewers of the channel will know I'm not exactly, the brightest bulb in the shed when it comes to solving certain puzzles in video games. And the writing could literally be on the wall, and I'll be like, I don't know what to do. Um, some of the puzzles were quite tricky, and I just spent
Yeah.
it, and I was like, huh, that's a really clever puzzle when I solved it. Um, kind of, were there any sort of like specific games where there were like puzzles and stuff where you thought, actually, there's a really cool puzzle, I kind of want to use that as a bait, or an almost kind of like springboard to kind of like jump off of?
So yeah, I think I mean it's probably the opposite, right? It's in art you have negative space drawings, right? So with this, I really liked hacking elements in just about any type of game. I mean, Fallout does it a little bit, Deus
Mm,
Ex did it quite a bit. Um, what I really wanted to do though was kind of put together a hacking game that broke the mold, I think, of the standard Hollywood type of hacking that's just way oversimplified, with these beautiful GUIs, and you press like, oh, the hack button, and you get this like nice little interface. I really wanted to strip it down and bring it to something that was raw, that was immersive, and that broke the fourth wall a little bit, right? Like you had to think on your own to try to solve some of these issues, to solve some of these puzzles. Whether it was taking pieces from one area and applying it to another puzzle, and then just sort of using that deductive muscle that I think a lot of us have. We just don't all get to use that often.
Oh, that's brilliant. I think you're right there. That kind of that deductive reasoning we don't often get to use. It was actually some of the puzzles. Once I got into the flow of it, and I was like, "Oh, this is what we're going for." The puzzle, I got a little bit
Right.
better with it. But those kind of initial ones, I was like, "I am completely stumped," and I felt really embarrassed. I was like, "I've got to interview this guy, and I can't get past the first puzzle."
No, no. I
But then
mean,
it
you
just
shouldn't be
took a while.
embarrassed of it. That's
Thank you. I don't now. But no, and the puzzles are really, really cool, and to kind of hear that kind of inspiration stuff is really, really awesome. So I've mentioned a few times this kind of incredible world that you've created. So Grey Blocks takes place in this kind of it feels very dystopian. In this very dystopian feeling world. It's actually quite oppressive. I found when I was exploring it and stuff, it was quite an oppressive world. Not overly oppressive, but you could feel this oppressive force within the world,
right.
which was really fascinating to kind of like be in stuff. And the more you explored the asylum, the more you play it, the more you learn about the world, and the more dystopian and oppressive it kind of feels, which is really brilliant in terms of like visual storytelling and stuff. How did you kind of manage and develop the world building aspects? Obviously, you said the idea of this came from kind of listening to a song and being like, "Oh, I want to do a game about this stuff." So how did you kind of
Mm.
manage and develop that world building? Because it is phenomenal.
Sure. Yeah. Obviously, number one, thank you. That means a lot. It's incredibly validating, and I'm gonna walk a little taller the rest of the day hearing that. It's good to hear, because it's exactly what I was going for. I mean, the world building to me, I've always been fascinated by dystopian stories, and I think one of the most I think one of the coolest and greatest sort of dystopian stories that has been told is in the movie Children of Men. I don't know if you've seen
Yes.
Children of Men,
Oh,
but I
brilliant.
love that it is a near dystopia. It's
Mm,
like the world around you, but with like this nice little veneer of dystopian aspects, with all these very real problems and present problems, and how they've sort of manifested in this new sort of alternate reality.
mm,
And I took that, and I kind of took there was the sort of corporate dystopia that exists as well, this sort of Randian type of dystopia that
mm.
I do kind of feel like we're careening towards
Oh,
as a
absolutely.
general society.
Yep.
um, and so it was sort of like there's an element of that in the game, in the original BioShock game, where you go into this
Mm,
doctor's office, and he's just given free reign to do whatever he wants to his patients, right? Because that's this dystopian
yep.
deregulated world, and he does that, and you see the results of it. And I wanted to take those two things, kind of mash them together, and see what that sort of BioShock world would look like in this sort of modern, or in a more realistic sense. Like, how would
Yeah.
that manifest in a world that is a little bit closer to home, a little bit less abstract? And I think that's kind of what you get in Gray Block. Like, you have to dig for it, and you have to see it. And so the perspective is very normal when you're looking at it. You don't see the crazy, like, I don't know, things that you would expect from a cyberpunk dystopia.
Yeah.
But if you read through some of the aspects in the lore, and you're sort of like going into it, you can see those elements.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, kind of prepping for the interview, reading some of the lore and stuff within the hospital, just in, like, it's not just stuff you read as well, but it's the incidental conversations that are had throughout between both Theo and Nikki as
Yeah,
well, that just give you
yeah,
this little bits of flavor text that just tell you this world
yeah,
might seem quite normal, but actually there's this really sinister
right,
undertone to it, which was just, and the more you play it, the more sinister it becomes. You're like,
right.
oh, I think the standout comment for me was like, oh yeah, no, it's fine. That guy's just going to be taken for a lobotomy. I was like, wait, what? Just so nonchalantly. I was a bit like,
Right.
oh, wow, we're in quite a dark world. But it's actually really interesting to how you're kind of, Children of Men is, if you've not seen the film, people that are watching this obviously do go and try and find someone to watch it, because
Mm,
it is phenomenal. Michael Caine in that film is quite possibly one of my favorite Michael Caine performances, actually, because he's
yes.
the last bastion of hope in a hopeless kind of world, which is just brilliant. But to hear how kind of like taking that modern kind of this oppressive, this kind of dystopian veneer, and then underneath it there's this like slightly more disjointed world like you get in Bioshock is really interesting actually. I felt that really came across. The more I think about it now, I can kind of see some of the kind of links to some of the more Bioshock abstract, kind of more quote unquote melodramatic dystopian
Right.
kind of feel, but with a kind of more naturalistic kind of approach to it. It was really interesting. So in terms of the games, and I'm also thinking you must just have hundreds of pages worth of like lore documents and Word documents with just lore information.
No, I don't. I
Really?
really don't. I swear I don't. I kind of just in my approach to the game, I was just like I was just writing stuff up.
Hmm.
So like I mean, this is a little bit of an Easter egg, but I don't know if you got to the objective page, but there's quite a bit of lore in there. And there's a piece about it's related to the hacking thing. It's this big long thing about the termite system.
Yeah.
And there's just like some element, there's some goofy thing about like guerrilla style bidet attacks on the Spanish Parliament. That I think if you haven't gone and looked for it, maybe
I'm
you
gonna go
should go.
back. I'm gonna
Yeah,
go
it's
find
good.
that now. That's amazing.
I just came up with that. I was just like, I'm typing and I'm just gonna like throw it in there, and
Yeah.
that's how it went.
Oh, brilliant. That's actually quite nice. But it's quite refreshing to hear a different perspective. Because a lot of people are like, oh yeah, no, I've got like 18 Word documents with loads and loads of pages and stuff. And I'm like, how do you manage that? Like my mind would melt. That many Word documents. I'd be like, no, everything
Yeah,
just needs to be like in one big like 400-page document, not like multiple little ones. And
sure.
people, I don't. But I hear that actually it was just like that seems like a good. I'm just gonna put that into the law because that works and that works and that way. That is actually really
Right.
refreshing different take. Um, Thinking more specifically again about the game's narrative. The narrative is brilliant. But there's also this absolutely wonderful balancing between the story elements of the game and the gameplay ones. Like a lot of the storytelling is done through these kind of incidental dialogues, moments, and the conversations between Theo, the protagonist, and Nikki, his kind of like his bestie, quote unquote. Um,
Right.
as you're playing through it, or that's as far as I go anyway. Um, Kind of how did you balance those? Because you seem to have kind of hit this almost sweet spot where gameplay is not being dropped for the sake of cinematic, and cinematic isn't being dropped for the sake of game. You've reached this really nice balance. How did you achieve that? Because it is fascinating.
I mean, I'm thrilled to hear that I've reached that level of balance. I wasn't. I don't know. I honestly, it encourages me to hear that there are people out there who feel that it is that balance. But to me, it was always immersion was the key driver for me. And in terms of just like games that I would like to make in the future, I find immersion to be I want that to shine through in anything or in any video game that I make or play. And I find that oftentimes in some games, like there can be these types of immersion breaking moments. I mean,
Yeah,
I think a good example is if you've ever played a game that's got this really great story and you end up in this like, for abandoned city, right? And you find yourself like pole vaulting and
yeah,
jumping and walking and running and like going under hoops, and you're like, but it's not because the city has fallen apart. That's just like the puzzle, that the puzzle serves the puzzle, and you have to like
yeah,
think to yourself, what poor denizen of this city had to do this to like go to the market, right? It
yeah,
almost seems like that to me is immersion breaking. And so I just wanted to make sure that every element in the game had some type of like reason, right? It
yeah.
had some reason related to the story. And maybe that's how it happened, is it was just ensuring that there was this tight sort of feedback
Yeah.
of gameplay elements and story.
And I think that definitely comes across during obviously I've not completed it yet. I'm about 4 hours in. My Steam playtime is longer because I spent a while on some of the puzzles. Um,
Good.
and
And then you
reading
get
some
those
of the
numbers up.
lore. There's really awesome lore in this game. Um, but yeah, I think you've kind of hit that, that's an important point you've raised. Actually, the game itself, the puzzles you've got and everything in the game is it's to create and to support that immersion whilst also driving forward the story in a way that doesn't break that. And I think that's
Right.
something that is really, really important across games. Some of the best games I know, kind of we've been having email chats and chats about kind of like narrative driven games and stuff. And I can think of some of the ones that we've been talking about in those emails where I was like, actually, there were moments in there that was very immersion breaking moments because you're
Yeah.
like, why do I have to do this? And like you say,
Right.
there is a franchise which shall remain nameless, where you have to go and collect 200 feathers, for example, and you just sit there going, but why?
Why?
Why do I have to collect 200? Why 200
Yeah.
first of all?
Right.
And why
Yeah.
have I sunk 10 hours of my life into collecting them?
Exactly. It's very conveniently 200. Why isn't it
Yeah,
199?
yeah, exactly. It's like, are you trying to tell me that this unmentioned character in this unnamed game collected 200 exact feathers and there's no discrepancy? I find that a bit sus. But yeah, back to the point, back to Grey Block. It's really nice to kind of hear how the focus was on immersion and kind of like, and the puzzles very much do feel part of the world. There wasn't a single puzzle that I've done so far where I kind of sat there and went, what? Obviously, there were puzzles where I sat there and went, what? Because I was
Yeah.
confused. But there were no
Right.
puzzles where I sat there and went, in terms of world building and in terms of narrative, I was like, oh, why? What? This just seems like way too much effort
Thank you.
to open a door. On the same thread of narrative, how did you kind of implement the broader narrative kind of aspects into the game to kind of complement that gameplay? Kind of obviously we talked about a bit about kind of like the focus on immersion stuff, but how did you kind of go about that process? Was it kind of like, I know that I need to have like a cutscene at the start of the game to kind of do the setup and stuff, and I know that I need to have a couple more cutscenes here and there. Kind of, how did you have set places for cutscenes, or did you kind of, whilst you're working on it, go, this might be a good point to give players a bit of downtime, give them a cutscene, allow them to kind of recharge and stuff?
Yeah. It wasn't that well thought out. It was Gray Block started with the story. So and if you play it, you'll probably, some people have come away with that. And others will probably come away with that as well, as that I wrote the story. And I mean, I was developing gameplay systems. I was kind of learning how to do game development because I didn't know how to do it. This is my first time. And so I wrote things I built the game around that story. And there were things that were in the story that didn't make it into the gameplay because they were too difficult to implement. But it was a matter of trying to find a happy medium between how do we tell the story and how do we sort of make an interesting game at the same time. And that's kind of how it worked. It was really just trying to find the path of least resistance,
Yeah.
and sort of game development that applied to the story.
Yeah, and obviously, games development is an unwieldy beast at the best of times. Because there is so much to think about, and it's not just like, and you can sit there like, I have this amazing idea for a mechanic, and then you sit down and you go, you might be discussing it with programmers, and they'll be like, I don't know how to do that, and you're like, well, I really want it in the game, but we don't know how to do it. And then you might look at other games and be like, they did something similar. Can we do that instead? Because that kind of might, yeah, no, because it is an unwieldy beast, but finding that balance is obviously really, really difficult. And from my perspective, from our perspective here at Robot Republic, it was something that really did come across with the kind of balance between story and gameplay and stuff. And I think a lot of that is because of the way in which you structured it, which was really nice for us, at least.
Thank you.
So thinking about, obviously, we've mentioned Theo, our protagonist in the game, is joined by at the very beginning of the game. And I'm not going to lie, at the start of the game, I was like, I don't trust her. Because you are met by a very enigmatic friend, Nikki, who just so happens to be able to, and I'm not going to spoil it for people, but she just happens to appear in very questionable circumstances. And it was a little bit confusing. And I was a bit like, oh, I don't really know what's going on here. But obviously, throughout the missions and throughout the games, in Theo's kind of quest to escape the asylum that he's trapped in, she's there to kind of provide support to a degree and also kind of provide world building and stuff. Was designing both Theo and Nikki, when designing both Theo and Nikki, how did you approach their character design and their personalities? Because I loved Nikki. I thought she was great. She was such an interesting and intriguing. I liked Theo. Theo was a really nice protagonist, but Nikki was so intrigued, and still am very intrigued by her as a character.
Yeah, very sassy. And
yes.
It was, let's see. So Theo's character design kind of, it just came from the story. So like I said, I started with an ending. And so I kind of just went from there and I designed this character and I was sort of like, well, started asking the questions of how would this person behave in order. So this is somebody who is victim to this giant conspiracy. They likely or they have a father that is very wealthy, very powerful, and they found themselves in this in this predicament. um to me, the type of person there would that would find themselves in that situation is kind of Theo's personality, like a little bit weaker, a little bit more kind of soft spoken, but also, as somebody who is the son of somebody who's very wealthy and likely powerful and probably grew up in the power structures, has quite a bit of cynicism baked into them,
Yeah,
right? Like you can tell Theo has this dryness, this cynicism
yeah,
that he just that colors his world. And then conversely, there was this assassin that um, met Theo's father, who and didn't like Theo's father, and instead trusted Theo. How would this person behave? To me, that was Nikki.
yeah.
Obviously, uh, Nikki would have some principles. She'd have a moral compass. And she'd have a very strong personality. And
Mm.
yeah, it kind of works in the game because that's those two sort of counteract each other. Where Theo's a little bit more reserved, but dry and cynical, and Nikki is very much the go-getter, and sassy and kind of poking and prodding at Theo,
Yeah.
which I really love.
Yeah, some of the time, and I think all credit to the voice cast in the game as well, because the voice actors for both Theo
They
and
were
Nikki
great.
portrayed the personalities of them so brilliantly, and
Yeah.
like it was really, really
Right.
kind of like the interactions. Some of the time, the interactions, really stressful moments in the game. Some of the interactions just made me laugh, which was
Yeah.
quite nice because I was like stressed out about things, trying to do some sneaking stuff, and it went badly. And then Nikki was just making sarcastic comments and jibes. I was just like, oh, okay, that's fine. I'm being mocked by someone in a video. This is good. This is fine. I'm happy now.
Right.
Um,
The fun part is that if you do get a chance to meet those voice actors ever, you'd realize that the characters are not too far from their personalities. So they did a great job of acting, but it's not like they really had to go too far beyond their existing personalities to
oh,
get
that's
there.
brilliant. That's amazing. Um, Because obviously we've mentioned a few times now the dialogue, which does a lot of the storytelling. And that by dialogue, it's not just the cutscene stuff; it's the stuff that happens whilst you're wandering around. Mainly through Nikki's, Theo's comments on the world and Nikki's kind of, sarcastic responses and all these other things. Really well written dialogue, um, which obviously, that allows players to be a lot more active in the world.
Mm,
I spent a lot of time for a narrative heavy game. I spent so much time actually playing and exploring, as opposed to just sitting there and absorbing information through
oh
cutscene after
wow,
cutscene after cutscene.
thank you. That means a
Um,
lot.
you're welcome. It's something that I'm really passionate about. This idea of like being an active player versus a passive observer is something
Yeah,
I'm very,
yeah,
very passionate about. And to spend so much time actually playing the game with it being so
right.
narratively heavy was something I genuinely loved. Um, how did you actually go about designing and implementing the kind of dialogue systems that are in the game? Because I know there are like an array of plugins and stuff. Like you've got the Wise engine and you've got all these other things that can kind of be used. How did you kind of go about both the designing of that dialogue? Because the dialogue is just some of it is so amazingly good. Um, I was just come back. It's that lobotomy moment because it's just said so like matter of factly, and I was just a bit like, what? Talking about a lobotomy like someone's just going to have a quick X-ray.
Right,
Like, yeah,
right.
so how did you approach that? Because it's so well done.
So on the systems, from an engine standpoint, it's really rudimentary. It's honestly, there's no real dialogue system that's going on under the engine. It's just very much raw audio played at the right times. In terms of writing it, it was uh, I really wanted like I said, the immersion to kind of shine through. So when you're too overt and you're too explicit and you're just like putting things in front of the player's face, it can
Mm.
sometimes it can sort of insult their intelligence. It can insult the player. But I think I want those things to be hidden a layer down, right? Like there is this little bit of abstraction that is, the point, right? And it's told in a dialogue. And so in through that lens, you can kind of you experience the world as Theo would experience the world, because it's kind of being told to him through Nikki, and it's being told to the player through Nikki as well. So I really wanted to kind of do that, and I really wanted to implement a lot of humor to kind of diffuse the tension in the game, because too much tension, it creates this sort of dynamic effect where, you know, it's not always just in your face, super tense. Being able to break that up, I think, is very important. And I think The Last of Us did that really well in the original
Yeah.
with Ellie and Joel. Like she created these really great moments where it's like, oh my God, this is hilarious, right?
It was
She's
those
telling her
moments.
sons.
It was those moments to breathe. And again, I
Yeah,
felt that's what came across in this game as well. It was just the moments of humor were so well choreographed into the overall. You know, you'd something really serious as a character, so really, really, you know, really tense, and there'd just be a bit of sarcasm or a bit of a joke or a bit of, you know, a snidey comment that just allows you as the player to just be like, oh, okay, it's okay, so I'll breathe for a
right.
second.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I just thought it was brilliant and so
Thank you.
nice as well. And like I said, you know, you also managed to achieve this really good balance with the tension and the breaks as
Right.
well, because there are games out there which just run at 100 miles an hour all the time, and after an hour and a half, you're like, oh god, I need a nap and some Prozac after that.
Yeah, yeah.
Whereas I thought, you know, this had a nice rise. You know, if it sounds really geeky, if you were to plot it onto a graph, it had these nice rises and falls, as they say. What am I talking about? Shut up, Josh. Get on with it. But yeah, so thinking more about the gameplay side of things, obviously we spent a lot of time working on and talking about the narrative, which is at the core of the game, and it's so good. And if you have yet to even look at this game, please, I urge you, once you finish watching this chatbot, go and play it on Steam. Go and get it on Steam because it is so good.
I urge you to, but I'm biased.
Yeah, obviously. The impartial one who loved it says go
Right.
and get it. Um, so the stealth action elements of the gameplay, particularly, and we touched on it a little bit. The kind of the interaction with the computers, the hacking and the puzzles and the exploration based puzzles as well, because it's not all just hacking based puzzle. There are some really
Mm.
quite cool kind of exploration based puzzles. There's one quite early on that involves you looking for a pipe to create some steam to shut down some cameras. I was like, oh, that's quite cool. I like that. We can damage the cameras through science, and this excites me. That sounded really nerdy. I apologize. You know, kind of so yeah, these elements that you've kind of integrated into the overall game, they work so well. And you know, you've touched upon the importance of making sure that the puzzles weren't immersion breaking. The puzzles are purposefully part of the world. They're things that would make sense in that game
Yeah.
world, and because there's a level of kind of realism to it, makes sense in everyday life as well. How did you go about designing some of these puzzle elements? I mean, we talked about the kind of like the focus on immersion, but in terms of the actual designing some of these puzzles, especially some of the really cool exploration based ones, how did you go about that? And did you did you want to ensure that all the puzzles, well, we've already kind of touched on it, but kind of that whole making sense within the wider game world, because there are some puzzle designs really good.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it. That is exactly what it was. It just had to make sense. If there was a puzzle there that, you know, you needed to move that blocked your path, or you needed to make some progress in the game, it had to fit with the world, and it had to fit with the story. It just yeah, like I said, immersion was key. And I think we've both played games where there's sort of this Deus Ex Machina that, you know, you're able to get out of this particular jam. I just didn't want to do that. I
Yeah.
really wanted to, if there was something, there were times, and in particular that one puzzle, the Steam puzzle, it took me a little while to come up with a way out of that one, right? So
Yeah.
you can kind of constrain yourself in certain ways, but that was one that I just spent some time thinking on, and I was like, how do I do this? Like, how do I disable this camera sort of this early in the game, and how do I make it make sense in the overall world?
Yeah.
being able to, obviously being a sole developer and not having anyone else to answer to made it easier for me to just kind of like okay, well, maybe this will work, and try it, and it did, I guess.
Oh, that's brilliant. I think you've touched on a really important thing there as well, is actually with the puzzles, it's that point of thinking them through. And
Mm.
does this make sense in the game world? In real life, does a, cloud of steam disrupt a camera enough to allow you to sneak past? Yes. Depending on the density of the steam, but generally, yes, it would. And it's quite nice to kind of, that focus on immersion, I think, is so important, especially in these types of narrative-driven games, because the second that immersion is broken, we've all been there as players where we've been playing a game and we've been loving the narrative, and then something happens and we're just a bit like, okay, well, how does that work? That just seems
Right,
like,
right,
oh, you've got to push a button over there and then 3 buttons over there and collect 12 keys with different
right,
pictures on them, and you're just a bit like, why?
right.
This
It's a
just makes
cool
no
puzzle,
sense.
but does
Yeah,
it actually work in this
yeah,
world? Like,
it's a good puzzle, but this just seems like, why? Ultimately, I can think of another game which I loved. I wrote a review for it on the Robot Republic website, where you have to collect different parts of a key throughout a village, and they block certain bits of a village off, and you just sit there and go, well, surely if you were a villager in this village, this would do your absolute head in.
right, right. Totally immersion
Yeah,
breaking.
it's like it's just a bit annoying. It just feels like you're doing this to railroad me, and I don't like that. Make the puzzles make sense.
Right.
Um, Talking about gameplay, then moving on a little bit from kind of like the puzzles and stuff. The combat in the game is really, really like smooth and dynamic. Like, it didn't feel kind of like juddery and janky or anything. It felt quite smooth and it made sense in the game
Right.
world. While you were working on that, kind of how important was the combat element to kind of overall development? I mean, there's a quote early on which I love about, we don't always have to fight. It's better to find a sneakier approach. I unfortunately do sometimes just walk through doorways and there's a guard standing there and I'm like, oh bugger. Um, how important was that to kind of like the overall process? Because the focus is more on the puzzles and the exploration and the story, but how important was it for you to make sure that the combat was really tight?
I had to, it was important. I had to make sure that the combat was believable, I
Mm,
think. And it was believable and serviceable. In terms of what is the hardest thing to design in a video game, or what was probably the hardest thing to design, it was likely the combat system. I mean, that's difficult
yeah,
when you have, I mean, just in terms of melee combat, that is immensely difficult, and it's things that people don't even realize. To have animations that are dynamic and reactable, like
yeah,
if you're not thinking of those things and you don't have answers for them, the combat can just seem ridiculous.
yeah,
And especially in a game world that sort of looks like Gray Block, where it's semi photorealistic, I
yeah,
think, or close to photorealism is what we're going for. When you have those things, like those sort of those disjointedness, or I don't know, whatever,
yeah,
it can just look really jarring, and it can really break the immersion. And so I needed something that was close to it, that was serviceable, and kind of worked with Theo. Like, Theo
yeah,
couldn't be this super jujitsu type of tank. He was somebody that was captured quite easily, and he wasn't able to kind of get out there. And so it had to work within the story as well. And so, I mean, if you're asking for my honest opinion, I think the combat is probably the area of the game that could use the most amount of work. But it's also because that is the most difficult thing
yeah.
to design, I think, for video games. It's just tough.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of experience kind of like with that, and combat systems are really difficult. And like you say, it's not just the numbers and the mechanics behind it, it's things like dynamic movement and
Right.
react and invert, things like inverse kinematics and animations, where if you get hit by something, if you get hit here, it's going to cause these to move. All of these bits and bobs that goes on behind the scenes, the bits that people don't necessarily see,
Right.
which takes so much time, and it does, and
Right.
it is a time sink. But I think from the bits of combat that I've done, I have managed to sneak through a lot of the combat situations, which I've been quite impressed with. But for the combat things I've done, I think for and you are, you're a solo, like you said earlier, you're a solo dev. To have a game that is this well developed is really, really awesome. And actually to have combat that, as a solo dev is that smooth. Some of my prototypes that I've done in the past for things, the combat has been absolutely terrible. I had monsters that could kill you but couldn't be killed. Try
Oh
explaining that one
no.
to players.
Yeah.
Quick rewrite of the narrative there. Oh yes, no, they can't be killed because of this reason. Because the code is broken. So yeah, but combat is probably one of the most challenging things, and there will be people in the chat who hopefully are video game developers or indie developers and stuff like that, or maybe even game students that are saying, "Oh, combat's really really easy," but it is to get it to work and be so smooth, especially in dynamic situations, is really hard. And I think
Right.
I think what you've done in the game is really really good.
Thank you.
Especially when like I said, as a solo dev, to have it being that smooth transition wise as well, it worked really nicely.
Thank you.
Thinking a bit more about the combat then, kind of obviously the player choice is kind of, there's this element of player choice which is central to the game. You always have the option in most, like the genre itself, of being more sneaky and trying to get around things and looking at kind of like, can I sneak past these guys, where can I hide, all these other things, versus the what I refer to as the bull in a china shop-esque kind of like, just bursting straight in and having a punch up kind of thing. Was that kind of like, was that a thematic choice, and did that evolve naturally, or was it kind of like a moment during the writing process where you were like, it's going to be this type of game, therefore it needs to have combat, and the combat needs to be like this, but I want to be able to ensure that players also can sneak around? Was that yeah,
Right.
that was a really badly worded question. Apologies.
No, no, it was fine. I think there are a couple of things there. In terms of the choice, I wanted a game that rewarded or sort of disincentivized combat. I mean, I like it, and I like combat elements, and I play games that are like that all the time. But I did want to put something out there that wasn't so unnecessarily violent, right? Or that did something a little bit different than just like, oh well, you have to kill these humans to win. It seemed, when
Yeah.
the more you start to think about that, the more it seems a little, I don't know, like maybe we should think about something different. But I
Yeah.
want it was a challenge to create a game that disincentivized combat. And so in the world of Gray Block, that's actually it fit pretty well with the story, right? Because here's this person who was faced this public trial and was thrown in jail for some terrible event that they were a part of. If they just blasted their way out of the hospital with this very wealthy and powerful father,
Yeah.
they wouldn't necessarily that they're not doing much to disprove the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not untangling the conspiracy. No one's going to believe that. It was easy to kind of make it a choice, like allow the player the choice to do that if they wanted to,
Mm.
but understand that the way to really win at this game is to not do that, is to find your way out without creating so much mayhem and
Yeah.
violence.
And I think that does come across, because I think the first time I had a bit of an oh dear moment and ended up in a bit of a combat-esque situation, Nikki made a sarcastic comment about, it was words to the effect of, well, that's going to help your case, isn't it? And I was like, do you know what? No, no, it's not actually, and I don't have a comeback. I just one of those moments where I was like, she makes a good point.
Yeah,
But yeah,
she talks shit. It's
she
fun.
does.
It's really
I
fun.
genuinely, I loved her as a character. She was so good.
Yeah.
Um,
I think
also,
that
I
there are players out there that didn't appreciate that, which I actually really love because like they
yeah,
did somebody who was so sassy talking to them in that way. So
I
I
loved
don't
it.
know. That was another reason for it.
Oh no, I loved Nikki. I thought she was great. I was a bit like, I don't trust you. This seems a bit too. I was a bit like, how did you get here?
Mm,
But and I think Theo, he's just like, how did you get in here without raising any alarms? I was like, that is my question right now. But then as you learn more about Nikki's character, you're just like, oh, that's how she did it. Okay, that makes sense now.
mm,
And I think that's one of the biggest kind of things as well, is that like the game, it doesn't just kind of like bombard you with information. You get the story develops and you learn more about the world and the characters as you're playing through it and stuff. And it is really fun. Like I haven't even finished it yet. It's on my list of things to do this weekend, is to finish the game, because it is really good and I really want to know what happens at the end. Um, Last few questions then. First one's about the sound design and the music in the game. Because obviously the sound and music are really, really integral, especially in these types of games, in terms of like setting moods and stuff. And what I really noticed, especially like whilst we've kind of been playing around with it, playing with the game or whatnot, the music and the sound design really kind of elevates the world
Oh, nice.
design, and it really kind of like what I was saying earlier about this kind of oppressive feeling. The audio and the music and stuff works really, really well. Um, when you were kind of tackling the kind of music and sound design, did kind of like did you spend a lot of time with a composer kind of like discussing the wider world of the game, or did you just kind of go, and here's what you got to do, get on with it?
So I'm sort of the composer, I guess. There is no. Honestly, all of the music that is in the game was purchased from the Unreal Engine marketplace. It's all pre-done. So what I did, I had an idea for the mood that I wanted to go for,
Yeah,
and I kind of just went through, the sound packs that were available on the marketplace, and I listened to all the demos, and I was like, oh, this has something that's really cool in it. And so it's a few things, it's
yeah,
it's made up of a few different aspects, and sort of they're all stitched together. They all, you know, they kind of work in that same almost like electronic synth genre.
yeah.
The opening is a little bit more of an urban vibe, and I don't know, it sort of worked like that. But again, it all tied back to that immersive aspect
Yeah.
where it was like, I think that sort of electro synth type of vibe speaks to like the futuristic aspects, right?
Yeah.
Like to this dystopian element. And so it was kind of going from there.
I actually have in my notes about the sound design. I literally just have Blade Runner esque, and it
Yes,
gave
I
it gave me
love Blade
it
Runner.
gave me Blade Runner vibes, and
Yes,
the original Blade Runner, not the new one from a
nice.
few years ago. But like it gave me like proper like old school Blade Runner vibes. I was like, oh, I like this. It's giving me Blade
Do
Runner vibes. This is good.
Do you want to hear something funny? So,
Yeah.
on the topic of Blade Runner, they used an anamorphic camera lens. So
Hmm.
if you watch that movie, it's shot with this really cool anamorphic lens. And I watched the original Blade Runner, and I was like, I love these cinematics. And so in Unreal Engine, you can actually customize your photo lens. And so all of the cinematics and Gray Block use the exact same anamorphic lens, the same aspect ratio that Blade Runner was shot in. And so
That is
that gives
awesome.
you, and what that gives you is you get those very long sort of, I forget what they call them now, but the sort of like long stretches of light,
Yeah, yeah.
and it puts the character very close to the front of the camera and creates this contrast against the backfield of view. I loved it. I was like, this is what I have to do.
Oh, yes, that's amazing. Actually, now that you've mentioned that, I'm kind of like unpicking some of the cut that opening cutscene in my head, and I'm like, oh my God, it is. That
Yeah,
is so cool.
yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm glad I put that in my notes now because that's a cool little
Thank
tip.
you.
Yeah, no.
Yes. I would have forgotten about it, but yeah, anamorphic lenses. I love them.
Oh, that's awesome. And to hear as well, like, yeah, the music was very Blade Runner-esque, and now that kind of like the use of those anamorphic lenses and stuff is so good. And Unreal is, as an engine, is so powerful, and it has so much stuff that you can do in it. Even a you know numpty like me that understands story and whatnot and design aspects, but is crap at coding, can make things work in Unreal vaguely. Um, so kind of like my final two questions are like we'll put them over there. I've got one really really important question to ask you before we kind of wrap things up, and I go into my last two. Obviously, like game UI is a very hot topic. Um, in terms of general design, and there are the lovers of the unnamed studio, overly cluttered, 3 bajillion things on it, and you want to it's an eyesore and a headache machine. um Grey Blocks has probably one of the least intrusive UIs I have seen outside of a From Software game, um because it's not at all. The UI is just so unintrusive, and you get the tutorials aren't rammed down your throat. You get a little pop-up box that kind of suggests things that might help, It's not a case of do this now. It's a case of like, and here is something that might help you. Explore and look around because you might find stuff. Maybe have a look at these things and do this on the computer. Maybe do. It's just so unintrusive, and I felt that was like the first thing I properly fell in love with. I was like, oh my god, I don't have a massive health bar. I don't have a huge ammo clip. I've not got a mini map taking up 2/3 of my screen. I've not got a bajillion things pinging at me. I've just got a really immersive game with the occasional little pop-up box, and it almost looked like text messages. I'm not gonna. It was like it almost felt like I was just getting text messages from the Blade Runner-esque sent directly to my brain, sort of thing. And that's how I decided to interpret it, which might not be what you were going for at all, but in my slightly bizarre brain, that's how I was going with it. Was the UI being unintrusive a really important factor when you were developing the game?
Oh yeah, 100%. I, like you, share the same opinions about these overly cluttered UIs. I know that they have their place, especially in large scale RPGs. It's you need it. It's tough to do it without it. With Gray Block and the sort of narrative based cinematic game that was going for a high immersion factor, having an overly sort of abundant and present UI there would totally it just severs the connection that you make to the player. So I wanted to convey the information that you absolutely needed. And that's it. So you get your little like weapon icon on the bottom right. Occasionally you'll get some pop-ups. And then even when you get into the pause menus, I didn't want them to be like huge, like really up on the screen. They're sort of off to the side. You get a little bit, that expands it as necessary. But that's a big driver for me. I mean, I go back to The Last of Us, but I thought that they were sort of the one of the biggest drivers of that, right? Like their UI is almost it's not there. It's a beautiful UI, but it's not in your face. And I think that kind of grounds the player to the game and allows them to sort of sit there.
It allows that. Yeah, I've always been a big believer that kind of games that have very minimalist UIs always feel a lot more immersive. Like you say, massive open world RPGs, you need a level of UI to help you where to go and stuff. But there are examples of big open world RPGs which are just besodden with just a bajillion icons, and you spend you end up spending about 20 minutes deselecting all the icons to turn them all off. And it's just I think like you say, with this, where it's so immersive and where the focus is on the story and the characters and the world that you're in, it's really important to kind of have that. And it was really refreshing to play this type of game where the UI was it was carefully thought out, and it was integrated into the game in a way that was so unintrusive. So thank you from someone who is a despiser of these things. So my final two questions, if you're a regular viewer of the show, you'll know exactly what these are before I even say them now. But my first one is, I ask it to everyone who comes on the show, what have been some of the biggest challenges during the development of the game?
6 years of challenges. So, I mean, as a solo developer, I started from zero. I knew nothing about, I'm a programmer in my day job. So I understood programming, but I didn't really work that strongly with C++. In terms of learning curves, I think it was just, directly related to the game. Animation, it's my worst area. It's tough. Animators are special people. They deserve, they deserve so much credit for what they go through. It's just, to get great animation, it's something that is taken so for granted by anyone who plays games that doesn't, you know what I mean?
Oh God, yeah.
And then, I think, so that was probably the biggest challenge. And then just sort of not really knowing how much was in front of me. I would sort of, I for like years, I thought, well, I just need to do this. I just need to get this. And then it's smooth sailing. And it's like, no, there's another hill, there's another mountain, there's another, obstacle. And, dealing with that along with some engine bugs, and also, you know, trying to be present in my real life and not neglect my actual relationships, you know, because I'm working a normal sort of 8 hour a day here in the United States, and then working from 8 p.m. to midnight or 2 a.m. on this game for 6 years. That it just wore on me, you
Yeah.
know. So by the time now that I've released it, I'm at the point where I just don't have a lot in the tank to do it without, uh, you know, to continue in the same mode.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that that was the biggest challenge, and ensuring that I, like, my worst impulses of sort of laziness and you know, just, I don't know, boredom didn't get the
Yeah.
better of this project. It was really about protecting the project from those impulses.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's actually really interesting. Actually, and thank you for sharing the whole kind of like actually the importance of balancing the project work and actual real life, because
Yeah.
you know these projects take so much time, and actually, you know, it is so difficult to balance a, you know, when it almost feels like you're spinning plates at some of the
Oh
times,
yeah.
I can imagine, you know, and there must have been moments where you were just like, oh my god, I just need like a break from everything.
Right. Definitely. Yeah.
Oh, but honestly, no, thank you so much for persevering, because this game is really, really good. My final question is kind of what is next, you know, in terms of both Grey Block and potential future projects. You know, is there going to be some story expansion for Grey Block? Is there going to be a Grey Block 2? And I will email you once I finish the game and be like, oh my god, we need one. I'm sure, so be prepared for that email. But yeah, what is kind of a next thing for Silver Rat Studios moving forwards?
So right now the nearest term thing is updating Gray Block and supporting it. I'd like to, or my an update that's coming in December, probably before Christmas, before the Christmas sale, is going to be getting subtitles in there, and any fixes to AI, and you know, things that I've gotten some feedback from some players on ways to make the game flow a little bit smoother.
Mm.
And so implementing those things to get them out of the way is as quick as possible, is top of mind. I do want to add controller support, so gamepad support would likely follow in the weeks after that. Potentially some localization to get some other countries to be able to jump in there and play it, because the game is very text heavy.
Yeah.
And then for future projects, honestly, it really kind of depends on how things go here. I have an idea that's kind of bouncing in my head, which kind of scares me because I might actually do it, about an add-on for Gray Block. You know, I'd like to kind of explore Theo's story a little bit more. I just have to think out how I could actually do it. And then, I mean, for future projects, this has always been a thing that would be the jumping off point. You know,
Yeah.
I'm a solo dev right now. I don't want to stay a solo developer. There's one thing that this whole experience has told me, is that I need help. And so it's going to be, you know, my next sort of few months or weeks are going to be reaching out and seeing if I can get some help. See if I can get a way to create a new project and an add-on. And I think I have ideas for stories within the world of Gray Block. Maybe not a, you know, potential sequel to it, but certainly things within the realm of Gray Block and future games that sort of act and behave like Gray Block, where they're
Yeah.
very narrative driven, cinematic, puzzle driven, and they make people think, and they'll have clean UIs.
That just ticks all the right boxes for me. I'm not gonna lie. There's like the mental checklist of what I want in a game. Really good
Yeah.
story, really narratively driven, really immersive, great dialogue, interesting world,
Right.
no crap UI. Just yeah. Oh, Ron, it has been such a pleasure having you on the show. Before I do my standard little outro thing, where can our lovely viewership find you and find more information out about Grey Block? There is, by the way, a link to Grey Block down in the description right now. So and I have banged on about it twice, and I'm going to give you a third time round. Go and check it out. But Ron, where can the lovely people find more information about you and future projects at Grey Block?
Yeah, you can go to silverratstudios.com, which is the main website, and I have my link to all my socials down there on the bottom. I have been in the past pretty active on Twitter, but with recent events, who the heck knows if Twitter is actually going to be around. So I've been thinking about trying to jump off, or try to sort of find a new way and a new outlet to reach people. I think Discord is probably going to be a good one. So there's a Discord server. I might create a Facebook and jump back to Facebook, but Discord, Reddit, Facebook, stay tuned. But essentially, if you want, you can go to the website, and I'll at least monitor my Twitter while Twitter is still active. So you can reach me there.
Yeah, I know that we're very much concerned about where Twitter's going right now because we're like, oh God, where are we gonna go? We're
Right.
our little indie media company. We're like, where do we go now? We're literally daily. We're like, what about this one? What about this one?
Please let me know where you guys go, because
Oh,
I'd like
absolutely.
to follow you there. And I mean, I really love what you're doing here. You have a great
Thank you so much. And thank you for coming on the show. Honestly, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you and such a pleasure to play this game because it is just so good. And like I said, do go out. There is, all of those links that Ron has just told us about are going to be down in the description. So do go and check out the website. Do go if it's still around. We don't know what's going on with Twitter, but do go and check out Twitter as well because it was there. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. If you liked this video, please do make sure you hit that like button and hit the subscribe button because we are back, people. We are going to be back in January with a whole new load of content coming your way. So please make sure that you hit that like and subscribe button now so you get all of the notifications for all of our new content when we are back properly in January. Ron, thank you so much for coming on. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This was
No
great.
worries. And keep in touch and take care. And we'll talk to you soon. And to everyone watching, you've been awesome. And we'll see you next time, guys. Bye.